"There is not a morning of my life," said Vaughan, Duke of Fairholt, "that I have not cursed the day her name was written beside mine in that register." The library door stood open the width of a hand, and he did not think of it once, not then, not for hours. Not until there was nothing left in the whole great house to think of but that narrow band of candlelight falling into the corridor. Lord Averill laughed and turned his glass in the firelight. He had come down from town for the shooting and had spent 3 days being amusing about the marriage, in the way of men who believe that cruelty becomes wit if it is said with a smile. "Come, Fairholt. She is handsome enough. She is quiet. She does not spend." "She does not spend," Vaughan repeated. "She does not spend, she does not ask, she does not complain. She keeps my accounts and my linen and my aunt's medicine, and she has never once in 4 months required anything of me at all." He set down his glass harder than he meant to. "Do you know what that is like, to be married to a clause? My father died and left a will, and the will left me Fairholt on one condition, and I met the condition, and now the condition sits at the foot of my table every evening in a grey gown, being faultless at me. Then send her to the dower house. I cannot send her anywhere. That is the point of her. She is not a woman I chose. She is a term of settlement in a lilac ribbon." He heard himself and did not stop, because the brandy was good and the fire was warm, and there is a species of grievance that feeds on being spoken aloud. "My father owed her family a debt of honor and paid it with my life. Every time I hear her name I hear the sound of a pen." Somewhere beyond the door a floorboard settled. He thought it was one of the maids going up with the water cans, and he thought no more about it than that. He came down late the next morning, being in no humor to be looked at, and the wrongness of the house met him at the foot of the stairs. It was nothing he could name at first. The hall smelled of cold ash. The tall clock on the landing, which was wound every Tuesday by a woman who had never once forgotten, had stopped at 4:20. Mrs. Headley was standing in the breakfast room with her hands folded in front of her apron and her eyes red at the rims, and the table was laid for one. "Where is her Grace?" "Gone, your Grace." The housekeeper's chin was up, but her voice was not steady. "She went out at 5:30. The carrier's cart takes the Cardamouth Road at 6 from the crossroads. She wouldn't have John put the horses to. She said it was not to be a trouble to anybody." He stood a moment with his hand on the back of a chair. "She has gone to her brother's." "No, your Grace." Mrs. Headley looked at the floor. "Begging your pardon, she has not." He went to the study because it was the nearest room with a door he could shut. The household ledger lay squared to the edge of the desk, and beside it the ring of keys laid out on a cloth, every key polished, and on top of the ledger a plain gold band and a folded sheet of paper. He opened the ledger first, which he was ashamed of afterwards, and the columns ran down clean and balanced to the last farthing of the quarter, ruled off with a double line, closed like a door. The letter had no reproach in it. That was the thing he could not get past, then or later. "Your Grace. The accounts are balanced to Mike Elmer's and the tradesman paid. The butcher's account has an error of 9 shillings in your favour, which is marked. Headley knows where the winter linen is kept and does not need to be told, though she will let you tell her. Your aunt's drops are in the blue cupboard on the second shelf, and she likes them at 4 o'clock with a little water, not before, because she frets in the evening if they come late. The chimney in the long gallery smokes when the wind is easterly and must not be lit. The schoolroom in the old dairy meets Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays, and Felto has the key. You will not need to trouble yourself about me. It was signed Constance Ashwell, not Constance Fairholt. Not C.F., her own name, the name she had carried before a pen and a dead man's word joined it to his, given back to him neatly, the way a servant returns livery on leaving. He went up to her rooms. The bed was made. The window was open 2 inches, as she liked it. On the dressing table stood the pearls he had given her at the wedding breakfast, still in their case, and the garnet cross that had been his mother's, and the cashmere shawl he had bought in town out of a vague, guilty impulse, and had never seen her wear. She had left every single thing he had ever put into her hands. She had taken a work basket, 2 gowns, a writing case, and her father's Bible. He rode to the Ashwell place that afternoon, and her brother met him in the yard without asking him in. "She is not here, your Grace." "Where then?" "She said you would come." The young man's jaw worked. "She asked us to say nothing, and I find I've no wish at all to disoblige her. She's had precious little of her own way for 4 months. He rode home the long way through the fields because he did not want to arrive. And that was when Fairholt began quietly and without mercy to tell him what he had married. It began with the boy at the forge who touched his cap and asked whether her Grace had had her letter about the indentures, because Sanderson at Whitcross had agreed to take him, and it was her Grace who had written. It went on with the widow Larkin, who came to the door of her cottage with the new thatch bright and yellow above her and asked God to bless the Duchess for it, and Vaughan had to stand in her garden and discover that his wife had paid for a roof out of the pin money he had settled on her and never mentioned it, not once. Not even when he had been sour with her about the cost of the London house. It went on for 11 days. The schoolroom in the old dairy, 3 afternoons a week, 22 children who could now write their names. His Aunt Sophronia at Barrow Deeping, 81 and half blind, who had received a letter every single Friday for 4 months in a hand large enough to read, and who wrote to him now to ask, with some asperity, what he had done. At the end of the 11 days he went into the library and shut the great door, and then opened it again exactly the width of a hand. Then he went out into the corridor and stood where she had stood, in the cold, in the dark, listening to a man's voice through a gap in a door saying that the sound of her name was the sound of a pen. He found her through her own accounts, in the end, which he thought she would have found funny if she had been the sort of woman who laughed at him. There was an entry every quarter day, small and faithful, going back years and continuing through the 4 months of her marriage, to Miss P. Odell, Cardinmouth. He remembered dimly a governess mentioned once at dinner, and remembered too that he had not been listening. Cardinmouth was a grey little place on a shingle bay, and the cottage stood at the top of a lane that smelled of salt and tar, and the front room had 6 girls in it sitting on kitchen chairs with slates on their knees, and Constance Ashwell was standing at the window with her back to the door, dictating a passage from a psalm and correcting somebody's spelling without turning round. She had grown thinner. She looked perfectly well. That was the part he had not prepared himself for, that she was not ruined, not fading in a garret, not waiting. She had simply gone somewhere she was useful and begun again, and the world had not ended, and she had not sent for him. The girls were dismissed. Miss Odell, a small, ferocious old woman, took herself off to the kitchen with a look that would have stripped paint. Constance stood with her hands quiet in front of her and said, "Your Grace," and offered him the chair by the fire, and asked after his aunt's health, and it was the civility that did it. He would rather she had thrown something. "You left the pearls. They were not mine, Your Grace. They belonged to the house. They were a gift. They were an obligation discharged," she said, without any edge at all, which is a different thing, and I have grown particular about that. The difference. He had come with a speech. He heard himself abandon it. "You were in the corridor." "Yes." "Constance, you need not apologize for the words." She sat down opposite him and folded her hands and looked at him steadily, and he understood that she had thought all of this out on the carrier's cart in the dark. "I have had some weeks be fair to you, and I find I can be. You did not curse me, I know that. You cursed the clause. But I have been the clause since March, Your Grace. I have kept your house and nursed your aunt and mended your tenants' roofs, and I have done it gladly, and every evening I have sat at the foot of your table while you looked at me and saw a document." Her voice did not rise. A woman can live along while unloved. "I had not understood, until I stood in that corridor, that I could not live being read." He said, "Come home." And she said, "No." She said it gently, which was worse. "If I come home tomorrow," she went on, "then you keep Fairholt. The condition holds, and the trust is yours, and the whole county says the Duchess has come to her senses. And I would sit at your table for 30 years, Your Grace, and I would never once know, not for a single hour of a single day, which of us you had kept, whether it was me or the paper. And I would ask myself, every day of my life I would ask myself." She smiled at him, and it was a kind smile, and it took the ground out from under him. "You could not answer it. I could not answer it. So there is no answer, and I will not come." He did not argue. He thought afterwards that it was the first wholly decent thing he had done in 4 months. He went back to Fairholt, and then to town, and he sat in a lawyer's office in a narrow street for the better part of 3 weeks. The title was entailed and could not be moved. The title was also, as it happened, worth very little. The money was the Fairholt Trust, the London house, the Northern farms, the funds his mother had brought, and his father had tied every penny of it to the one condition, and the lawyers had spent 4 months congratulating him on having satisfied it. He instructed them to make the entire trust over to Constance Ashwell Fairholt, absolutely, in her own name and to her sole and separate use, irrevocable, whether she ever set foot in his house again or not. They told him it was madness. They told him she might live at Cardinmouth on 11,000 a year and never write to him. They told him he would be left with a great cold house, a great cold title and the drains. He signed on a Tuesday afternoon with the rain coming down the window in ropes, and he had not felt so light since he was a boy. He carried the papers to Cardinmouth himself and did not stay above 10 minutes. He put them on the table by the window where the slates were stacked, and he explained them once, plainly, and he did not touch her hand. "It is done," he said. "It cannot be undone. I have seen to that. Fairholt is yours whether you come or whether you do not, and if you never come it is still yours and I shall manage." He picked up his hat. "You said you would never know which of us I kept. Now there is nothing to keep but you. There has been nothing else worth keeping since March, and it took me until my house went silent to hear it." He stopped at the door. "You are not a clause, Constance. You were never a clause. You were the only thing in that house that was alive." Then he went out into the rain and rode home and did not write to her, though he began 9 letters and burned all 9, which is its own kind of prayer. She came on the 11th evening in a hired chaise, in a soaking November dark. He was in the study with the fire out and the household ledger open in front of him, trying and failing to make the butcher's account come right, when he heard wheels on the gravel, and then Mrs. Headley's voice in the hall doing something entirely improper with a cry in it. He got to the door of the study and no further. Constance stood in the middle of his hall with the rain still on her shoulders and her bonnet strings undone, and she was holding the household ledger's twin, a new one, plain, bought at Cardinmouth, with a single line ruled at the head of the first page in her clear hand, for the quarter beginning. "The butcher," she said unsteadily, "will have cheated you by now. 9 shillings, he said. Least 9 shillings. I did wonder." Her chin came up and her mouth trembled, and she stood her ground in the middle of the floor. "I have not come for the trust. I want that understood. I have come because a man who signs away 11,000 a year to a woman in a fishing village has told me the truth at last, and I have been waiting 4 months and 11 days to be told the truth by you." He crossed the hall. He took the ledger out of her hands and set it on the table, because his own hands were shaking and he wanted them free, and then he took her cold fingers in both of his and bowed his head over them and said her name. He said it the way a man says a word he has been given back after nearly losing it for good, carefully and out loud and twice. The rest of that evening belonged to the two of them, and to the fire Mrs. Headley built in the small parlour without being asked, and to a door that closed on the warm dark. Fairholt learned her name that winter, and never afterwards forgot it. The old dairy has 40 desks in it now and a proper stove, and the roof of the long gallery was mended in the spring out of money that was hers to refuse and did not. Aunt Sophronia's letter still comes every Friday, in a hand large enough to read. And every morning of his life at the foot of the stairs, the Duke of Fairholt says good morning to his wife by a given name, deliberately aloud, the way a man tends a fire he has learned he cannot live without.